So I thought we were going to try a brand new series here. I'm someone that has always enjoyed a good documentary, and in most cases, it's never really mattered much to me what the subject of the documentary was, as long as the journey was accurately portrayed and not overly editorialized. Since I'm always looking for recommendations on what documentary to watch next, I figured maybe some of you out there might benefit from that as well. Even if you're not into documentaries, maybe you'll at least be entertained by a brief review. I'm going to try and stay away from providing my own opinions on the topic too often, but it's unlikely I'll be able to stay away from it entirely. I want to try and comment on the way the film is shot, the actual production quality, and whether or not the film left some sort of lasting effect. My hope is that the series will become a mainstay, an interesting subcategory on this channel, in addition to the stuff I'm already producing. That said, let's get into my very first review of the 2017 documentary on life in an Indian textile factory called Machines. I started by trying to research the director a bit ahead of time to try and understand if I need to be on the lookout for any agenda. And I was really happy to see that Rahul Yan seemed to be at least really understand the complexity of the problem that he was trying to document.
Of course, we can implore them to make changes, but when money is being made, nothing is really considered. I sound really hopeless, but I think if people fully understand the things that they're buying and how they are made, and they act on that, I think consumers have power. The only people that can make change here are the consumers too. They can stop buying things. But again, if you stop buying things from India thinking that their effects are not good on the environment, then many people will go out of jobs too. So it's not a black and white situation.
He also shared that he did have some firsthand experience around these types of factories when he was a kid because his grandfather owned and operated one. With an endless sea of options to choose from, I tried not to overthink the first one too much. I just picked one that seemed interesting and I watched it. And then I watched it again, and then I watched it a third time. I didn't want to choose one that I had already seen, and I wanted to take down my reactions in real time. And this film delivered a lot of them. So I thought it would be a pretty good subject for my first review. Machines, again, captures the daily work at a textile factory and features short interviews with several of its workers. Jan said that he wanted to pose the very simple question that had really been plaguing him since his childhood. The quote is, "Growing up in India, but also in a political, socio-economically upper-class background, I had always been curious, how can somebody who serves me wine make half the value of that bottle of wine in a month, while people just gulp it down?" It was a very simple question that an economist would easily answer, he said. But I didn't go to an economist. I went to art school. So the film basically starts out with 10 minutes of uninterrupted raw footage of the conditions, and it was brutal. Even with documentaries, you have to be careful, as the films usually feature some slant, and some really have far more sinister plans as pieces of propaganda. I asked myself a couple of times, I didn't know if the director had really, for this particular film, chosen the absolute worst and most disgusting conditions he could have to feature in the film. I'm assuming he did, but there were a few times it really made me think about checking the tag on my shirt. You're drawn into the faces of all the workers, sweaty, tired, not a single smile among them, all wearing drab clothes, a contrast really artistically to the cloth, the brightly colored cloths they're all working on. you also immediately notice that, people like things like people moving giant barrels of chemicals. One guy has a 220 kilo barrel of chemicals that he moves with a metal bar, and he's just kind of pulling it. No safety equipment in sight, no gloves, no eye protection, nothing. Nobody's talking. You figure out pretty quickly that why he chose the title he did, because the workers in the factory move as though they are literal machines. And I don't know if that was his intended, it was intended or not. I haven't found anything where he says that, but that's what I got from it. The director really provides visually stunning shots. It really was a treat for the eyes. Stark contrast to the continually highlighted with high quality B-roll shots of the workers, for example, bathing together in the same water the factory uses to like spray the dye out of cloth. And speaking of the camera work was really solid in my opinion. It featured lots of single one-take shots navigating the labyrinth-like rows of the factory. If he wasn't using a Steadicam rig, his skills are godlike. The floor was littered with things to trip over, and things to bump into, but whoever was holding the camera seemed to be using their sixth or even seventh sense. The shots also managed to survive what was pretty poor lighting. So overall, visually, I think the film is really, really stunning. You would think shooting this inside of a factory also, the audio would be trash, but it really wasn't. It seemed like they managed to find some quiet areas to do interviews in little corners of the factory or in brief moments of when things quieted down. So overall, I thought the audio was pretty solid. I mean, it could have been better, but overall, I thought it was pretty decent given the conditions. From an editing standpoint, I thought it was pretty well edited as well. It wasn't entirely linear. He did manage to jump around, and I appreciate that in documentaries. Going forward, let you consume some more information, then jumping back, then going back forward again. But it still seemed to flow from the factory workers to the conditions to upper level management to buyers, things like that. One critique I had was I wished at times that the director had spent more time sharing some of the economics of what these factories charge their overseas buyers. Would have also liked for him to get some footage of what some of these workers' home lives look like. I found myself wondering a lot what that looked like, considering they're working 80 to 100 hours a week. I wanted to know what they did in their very, very short windows of free time. For people who work 12-hour days nonstop, do they see their families? What would that interaction even look like? Another interesting take on editing in this documentary was there was no narration. At no point do you hear the interviewer, no voiceover. He instead lets the camera and the interviews paint the entire picture, and that is something I actually really enjoyed. It made me feel like I couldn't look away from the screen. It really forced me to be engrossed in the film, which is not normal for me. I usually do multiple things at once while I'm watching a movie or television show and kind of rely on dialogue to keep me interested. That was a refreshing change. The interviews themselves felt like just the right amount. Part of me would have loved to see maybe one or two more, but the ones that were in there were very solid. He gets into what the workers are paid, something like 210 rupees per 12-hour shift. And the factory also provides loans at 10% interest. And how many of the workers work from 8 to 8, take a single hour off, and then come back for the 9 p.m. shift, because that's what they must do to survive. There's one really powerful interview with a worker where he says very plainly that he doesn't see himself as of being taken advantage of so much by the factories, rather a victim of the situation. And they share interesting information about how they make it through the day. Interesting anecdotes about how about the only thing they can afford is chewing tobacco, and while they would prefer to smoke cigarettes, just buying plain chewing tobacco is much cheaper, and they can get enough chewing tobacco to go through the whole day to stay stimulated and stay, awake, I guess, given working all day. And when he interviews some of the bosses, they come across just about as evil as you might imagine, saying things like starving people work harder And once people make a fair wage, they don't work as hard, and then he wants them out of the company. It begs the question why the workers don't unionize, and they do touch on that. The workers do not unionize because they don't necessarily really work together. Long shifts make them too tired to fight. I think somebody says something about how they come in as lions, but at the end of the day, they're sheep because they're so tired. They have to buy food and water from the factory, and the bosses really talk about these people as slaves, really. They don't know that they have any other option. They don't have any other option in many cases. One man specifically talks about how when they try to unionize, they're so easily defeated that most wouldn't even try. The workers that, they have a very hard time joining forces because while one person feels like it's worth it, the man next to him is, they're both so poor that he can't even fathom fighting against it. He's just trying to put food in his belly or in his family's belly, so they can't really risk it. One of the most powerful moments in the film, though, was when he's walking around with the camera and there's this kid sitting on some sort of machine, literally falling asleep while standing up. I just kept wondering to myself, how many of these people fall asleep and then just fall into these giant behemoths of machines? There's also a really good scene in the film where they're interviewing workers outside of the plant. One of the workers asked the documenter point blank, will you be like everyone else? Will you come here and just look at our problems and leave? That's kind of how I felt watching this film from my living room. This is the point of the film where you start to ask yourself some of the hard questions. What is the long-term solution for these people? Is this just the way the first and third world will always interact? Given that right next door is another country full of starving people willing to work for pennies. And it's good to see that the director himself in interviews outside of this seems to understand this.
How to fix the disparity in different kinds of trades between the third world and first world? That is rather a difficult question. I'm not an economist, but to know even where your fabric comes from, how much is the manufacturing price, when you're buying something expensive in a developed world, shopping experience, we don't really question those things because we have been conditioned to paying a lot of money for these things. The behemoth that global capitalism is, most of these facts are hidden away from the buyers, and to put all the details in the shopping experience would be somewhat of an elucidating point to move forward. There are CEOs that bank a lot of money with this incredibly intense disparity between the cost price and the selling price. And I think we just need to start imploring the big companies to not buy a BMW and be happy with a Toyota, which is, I think, impossible in some ways until some kind of governmental regulation is imposed on the amount of profits that can be made. But who can do this? I don't know.
Overall, I found myself wanting to see a little more detail from the film, a little more investigative things, but I don't think that's the kind of film he wanted to shoot. The way it was shot, the editing, the pacing, and its ability to provoke some thought in me about the struggle between consumers taking actions to essentially stop this to protect the environment, balance with the real world reality that if this happened, all of these people would be out of work. It's a complicated question. I don't begin to pretend I know the answer to. Global capitalism is, as the director puts it, a giant behemoth. So I'm not skilled enough to understand that, but I do still find some enjoyment in trying to engage it in small bite-sized pieces. I'd give this documentary a solid recommendation. Rahul, the director, in my opinion, accurately describes this film as not just for activist-minded people, but also appeals to people who just like films in general. And that's kind of where I lie. Wouldn't consider myself an activist, but I do when I watch something on TV. I prefer to be provoked and thought and be educated.
And with the aesthetic and political dimensions of the film, it's completely correct that this film is not just for somebody in the place of an activist. It's also for somebody who enjoys films, interpreting them from an aesthetic standpoint.
You know, and it's just a solid recommendation. It's an hour that I think is probably worth donating if you're in one of these two camps. You know, helps that it's also free if you're an Amazon Prime member. You know, if you've seen it, I would love to hear your take. If you watch it, come back and let me know what you think. I look forward to your recommendations for the next documentary to review. I would love to do these once every week or every 2 weeks. And I think we can build a pretty interesting conversation and helpful tool for other people that like to have stimulating thought, and maybe people who just enjoy documentaries or films themselves. So thanks for watching this video, and we'll talk to you again real soon.